As the bullets started to fly, she collapsed in pain. The siege had begun outside, and her baby was coming inside. Betrayed by family, left for dead in the brutal snows of a Wyoming winter, a pregnant widow could do nothing but wait for the end. But as her last breath drew near, fate sent a shadow across the ice, a reclusive giant more fearsome than the wilderness itself. This is not a story of rescue. It is a testament of survival, written in blood, loyalty, and gunfire. The Wyoming wind was a merciless thing, a predator that gnawed at the seams of the crude lean-to and stole the last of the warmth. Eleanor Vance, known only as Ellie to the man she'd buried, pressed a hand against the tight swell of her belly, a futile gesture against the cold that had settled deep in her bones. The fire, once a roaring testament to her husband's hope, had dwindled to a handful of sullen, red-eyed embers that offered no comfort, only a slow countdown to the inevitable. Outside, the world had been erased by a blizzard, leaving only the sound of the wind's howl and the crushing weight of a silence that felt older than the mountains themselves. Caleb Thorne's promise echoed in that silence, a bitter phantom of a voice that had been smooth as river stone and just as hard beneath. "We'll be back for you, Ellie, just as soon as we secure the pass." He had looked her in the eye, his face a mask of concern, while his men stripped their wagon of the last good tools and the bulk of their supplies. They had left her with a dying fire, a half-empty bag of cornmeal, and the grave of the man his greed had already consumed. They left her to be swallowed by the winter, a burden shed in the relentless pursuit of silver. The last of the tallow candles guttered in its tin holder, the flame dancing a final, frantic jig before surrendering to the dark. For a moment, Ellie felt a strange sense of peace. The fight was over. She thought of Liam, of his gentle hands, and the way his eyes would light up when he spoke of the future they would build, the son or daughter they would raise in this wild, beautiful country. She closed her eyes, ready to join him, to let the encroaching numbness carry her away. The baby inside her gave a sudden, powerful kick, a fierce protest against her surrender, a final, desperate plea for life. It was then that she heard it, a sound that did not belong to the storm, a heavy, rhythmic crunching in the snow, too deliberate for a wolf, too powerful for a deer. Her heart, which had been slowing to a crawl, gave a painful lurch. Through a tiny gap in the patched-up canvas wall, a faint light bobbed in the swirling whiteness, a lone lantern swinging in the gale. A figure on horseback emerged from the blizzard, a silhouette so immense it seemed carved from the mountain itself. It was no savior from a prayer. It was a specter, a giant draped in shadow and snow, and as it stopped before her crumbling shelter, Ellie Vance didn't know whether to scream for help or pray for a quicker death. As the giant's shadow fell over her, the world dissolved not into the cold of death, but into the warm glow of a memory. It was 6 months ago, under a kinder sun. She and Liam were huddled over his geological map, the paper worn soft with handling, its lines and figures a testament to a dream that felt as real as the baby growing inside her. Liam's finger, stained with the red dirt of Wyoming, traced a vein of promise through a cluster of contour lines. "Right here, Ellie," he'd whispered, his voice full of a reverence that was almost religious. "Enough to build a town, not just a life. A school for you to teach in, a proper home for the little one." The dream had a name, and that name was Caleb Thorne. He had ridden into their camp with a charming smile and a silver tongue, spinning tales of fortune that had captivated the other prospectors. He was nothing like the quiet, thoughtful man Ellie had married. Where Liam saw the land as a partner to be understood, Caleb saw it as a beast to be broken. The tension between them had been a low hum beneath the crackle of the nightly campfires, a quiet discord only Ellie seemed to hear. She remembered the day it had sharpened into something ugly. Caleb had cornered Liam by the creek, his voice a confidential murmur. "Sell me the claim, Liam. I'll give you a fair price, cash in hand. No risk to you or your new family. Liam had simply shaken his head, his gaze steady. "It's not for sale, Caleb. The value here isn't just in the silver, it's in the building. I won't have it torn apart by speculators." Caleb's smile had faltered for a fraction of a second, his eyes going cold and flat as a frozen lake before the mask of charm slipped back into place. "Your choice, friend. Your choice." 2 weeks later, the world had ended in a roar of splintering timber and collapsing earth. The mine shaft, which Liam had insisted was sound, had given way. Caleb had been the one to pull her away, his face a perfect picture of grief as he spoke of a freak accident, a geological fault no one could have predicted. But his words felt hollow, his sorrow too loud. Now, in the frozen dark of the lean-to, the memory of his cold eyes by the creek burned brighter than the last ember of her fire. The accident felt less like fate and more like a promise kept. The giant figure dismounted, his boots sinking deep into the snow, and the memory shattered, leaving Ellie shivering in the brutal present, the warmth of the past making the cold feel that much crueler. The man moved with a purpose that defied the storm. He didn't speak, simply brushed the snow-caked canvas aside and knelt. In the faint glow of his lantern, Ellie saw a face carved from granite, framed by a thick, dark beard, and eyes that held the flat, weary look of an old soldier. He was immense, his shoulders straining the seams of his heavy buffalo coat. Without a word, he scooped her into his arms, as if she weighed nothing more than a child. The shock of his strength, of being held, was so overwhelming that a sob caught in her throat. But no sound came out. He wrapped her in a heavy wool blanket from his horse, his movements rough but efficient, and mounted, settling her in front of him. The world became a blur of swirling snow and the steady warmth of his body shielding her from the wind's bite. She drifted in and out of consciousness, waking to find herself in a cabin that felt more like a fortress. The walls were made of thick, perfectly joined logs, the furniture solid and sparse. A fire roared in a massive stone hearth, but the room felt cold, inhabited only by long, dancing shadows. Her rescuer moved about the space with a grim silence, ladling hot broth into a mug and pressing it into her hands. He took her wet things and laid them to dry, his actions speaking of a duty performed, not a comfort offered. He was a provider, not a companion. When she finally woke properly, the storm had quieted to a low moan, and pale morning light filtered through a single clean window. The man was gone. She was tucked into a bed that felt impossibly soft, the scent of pine and wood smoke clinging to the blankets. Her gaze traveled around the main room, taking in the austerity of it all. The bare wooden table, the neatly stacked firewood, the rifle resting above the mantel. It was a place built for survival, not for living. And then she saw it. Propped on the mantelpiece, half turned away, was a small, framed portrait, a daguerreotype of a woman with a gentle smile and a little girl with bright, inquisitive eyes nestled in her lap. A floorboard creaked, and the giant of a man filled the doorway, his presence sucking the air from the room. He saw where she was looking. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, an emotion flickered in his eyes too deep and painful to name. He crossed to the fireplace in 2 long strides, took the portrait, and without a word, turned its face to the cold stone wall. The finality of the gesture was absolute, a door slamming shut on a part of his soul. He turned back to her, his expression once again an unreadable mask, leaving Ellie in a silence more profound and chilling than any mountain storm. Days bled into one another, each marked by the silent routine the man established. He would leave food for her on the hearth, stack fresh firewood, and then disappear, leaving her utterly alone in the vast silence of the cabin. His name, she learned from the inscription on a leather-bound Bible, was Elias. He was a ghost in his own home, and she was his unwilling guest, a stray he had taken in from the cold but refused to acknowledge. The health returned to her limbs, but a different kind of chill set in, the profound isolation of a shared space where no words were exchanged. The cabin was a shelter, but it felt like a cage, however well-intentioned. The monotony was broken by the arrival of a wiry old man on snowshoes, his face a road map of wrinkles etched by 1,000 winters. He introduced himself as Hemlock, his voice a gravelly rasp that seemed startlingly loud in the quiet cabin. He brought a quartered deer and news from the outside world, speaking to Elias in short, clipped sentences, as if they were continuing a conversation that had been paused for weeks. His eyes, sharp and intelligent as a hawk's, took in Ellie's presence without surprise, only a deep, abiding sadness. While Elias was out tending to the horses, Hemlock sat by the fire with her, whittling a piece of wood into the shape of a bird. He didn't ask her story. He seemed to know enough. Instead, he spoke of Elias, his words painting a picture of a man hollowed out by grief. "Lost his wife and little girl to the same kind of blizzard that nearly took you," Hemlock said, his gaze fixed on the fire. "He was away selling horses, got trapped by the storm on the way back. By the time he made it home, it was too late." Ellie felt a pang of understanding, a kinship with the silent giant who haunted the cabin. It wasn't cruelty that kept him distant. It was a pain so vast it had consumed him. She watched through the window as Elias worked, his powerful frame moving with a relentless energy, as if trying to exhaust a sorrow that could never be tired. Hemlock followed her gaze, his voice dropping to a near whisper, a final cryptic observation that would echo in Ellie's mind for days to come. "That storm took Sarah and Lily from him, sure enough," the old man rasped, testing the edge of his knife with a thumb. "But it's the silence that's burying him alive." Sleep offered no escape, only a different kind of torment. Ellie found herself back in the canyon, the sun warm on her face, the sound of Liam's pickaxe echoing against the rock. She saw Caleb approach him, the friendly smile on his face a grotesque mask hiding the predator beneath. Then the world fractured into a symphony of groaning timber and shattering stone. She screamed Liam's name as the earth swallowed him whole, the sound catching in her throat as she jolted awake, drenched in a cold sweat, her own voice a raw whisper in the darkness of the cabin. Heavy footsteps pounded across the floorboards, and Elias filled the doorway, a lamp held high, casting his giant frame in flickering gold and shadow. The alarm on his face was raw, unguarded, a crack in the granite facade. He saw the terror in her eyes and stopped, his presence a silent anchor in the swirling chaos of her nightmare. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He simply waited for her ragged breaths to slow, for the phantom sounds of the mine collapsed to fade from her ears. "I'm sorry," she finally choked out, wiping tears from her face with a trembling hand. "A bad dream. About my husband. Liam." The name felt strange on her tongue, a relic from a life that no longer felt real. Elias gave a slow, deliberate nod. He crossed to the hearth, stoked the embers back to life, and returned with a cup of warm water. He stood there for a long moment, watching the firelight play on the rough-hewn walls, his back to her. "My wife," he said, his voice a low rumble, rough with disuse. Her name was Sarah. The girl was Lily. It was not an apology or a story, but an offering, a piece of his own shattered past laid bare in the quiet dark. In that moment, the space between them was no longer a gulf of silence, but a bridge built of shared, unspeakable loss. Ellie felt a profound wave of gratitude, a sliver of trust for this broken man who had sheltered her. "You saved my life," she said softly, "and I don't even know your full name." He turned from the fire, his face half in shadow, the weariness of the world settled in his eyes. "Elias," he said. "Elias Thorne." The name struck Ellie with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. Thorne. The fragile bridge of trust evaporated, replaced by a chasm of ice and suspicion. The man who had just shared her grief bore the very same name as the man who had authored it. The silence in the cabin had changed. It was no longer a quiet born of grief, but a heavy, watchful stillness thick with suspicion. Every move Elias Thorne made, every log he placed on the fire, seemed freighted with a hidden meaning Ellie could not decipher. She watched him from the corner of her eye, this giant of a man who shared the blood of her betrayer. Was his kindness a lie, a carefully constructed trap? Her mind, the sharp, analytical mind of a Boston schoolteacher, raced through the possibilities, each one darker than the last. Gratitude was a luxury she could no longer afford. She needed answers. While Elias was out checking his trap lines, she went to the small canvas satchel that held the last remnants of her former life. Her fingers trembled as she pulled out the oilskin pouch, the one Liam had guarded so carefully. Inside was the map. Unrolling it on the rough wooden table was like opening a wound. The familiar lines and symbols, the scent of worn paper and ink. It was all that was left of their dream. She traced the path they had taken, the location of their final camp, the spot marked with a small, sad X where the mine and her husband lay buried. Grief gave way to a cold, sharp focus. She forced herself to look at it, not as a widow, but as Liam's student, remembering the nights he'd patiently explained the language of the earth to her. And she began to see what her sorrow had previously blinded her to. The notations weren't for a simple silver strike. They depicted a complex network of veins, a massive lode that snaked deep into the mountain. This wasn't the foundation for a small homestead. It was the kind of discovery that built empires and drove men to madness. It was a secret worth killing for. Her breath caught. There, in the lower margin, tucked away beneath a table of mineral assays, was a line of text she had never seen before. It was written in Liam's small, precise script, the words of a man recording a terrible certainty. Her finger traced the faint pencil markings, and the last vestiges of her doubt turned to ice in her veins. It read, "Caleb knows. God forgive him." In that moment the cabin felt like a tomb. The wind outside rose to a mournful shriek, but Ellie didn't hear it. She was staring at a dead man's last will and testament, a declaration of his own murder. The door creaked open, and Elias Thorne's shadow fell across the map. He was no longer her rescuer. He was a thorn, and she was alone in the wilderness with her husband's killer's brother, holding the very thing he had likely killed for. The map was hidden, tucked back into its oilskin pouch and buried deep within her satchel, but its terrible secret remained between them, a sheet of ice on the hearth. The fragile piece of their shared existence was gone. Ellie moved with a quiet caution, her body tense, while Elias watched her, a question in his weary soldier's eyes that he would not ask. The standoff was broken not by a word, but by a sound from the attached stable, a high, panicked whinny from Elias's horse, followed by a low, guttural snarl that was not the wind. Elias was on his feet in an instant, his lethargy gone, replaced by the focused intensity of a predator. He grabbed the heavy rifle from the mantel, his movements fluid and certain. "Stay away from the window," he commanded, his voice a low growl that was nearly as menacing as the sounds from outside. Another crash came from the stable, the splintering of wood, followed by the terrified lowing of the milk cow. It was not one wolf. It was a pack, driven down from the high country by starvation, and they were tearing their way in. Scrabbling claws scraped against the heavy oak of the cabin door, a dry, frantic sound that sent a jolt of pure terror through Ellie. While Elias checked the door's heavy bar, a snarling grey head appeared at the window, eyes burning with a feral yellow light. Elias didn't hesitate. He swung the rifle, the blast deafening in the enclosed space, shattering the glass and the wolf's skull in a single violent eruption. Before he could even work the lever for another shot, a second wolf, leaner and quicker, threw itself against the weakened shutters of the kitchen window. Wood splintered. Fear gave way to a cold, sharp instinct for survival. Ellie saw the heavy iron poker resting by the fire, its tip glowing a dull red. As the wolf's head and shoulders forced their way through the broken shutter, she grabbed the poker, its heat searing through her sleeve. She didn't scream. She didn't think. She lunged, shoving the glowing tip into the creature's snarling face. The wolf shrieked, a sound of agony and rage, and recoiled, pulling its bloodied head back into the night. The immediate attack subsided, leaving only the frantic panting of the horse and the sound of two people breathing heavily in the sudden ringing silence. Ellie stood trembling, the poker still clutched in her white-knuckled hands. The cabin was a wreck of shattered glass and splintered wood. Elias slowly lowered his rifle, the immediate threat gone. He looked from the broken window to the poker in her hand, then finally to her face. The suspicion was gone from his eyes, replaced by something else, something she had not seen before, a raw, grudging respect. "You're not a burden," he said, his voice quiet but clear over the pounding in her ears. "You're a fighter," and in that moment, surrounded by the evidence of their shared battle, Ellie didn't know what to fear more, the wolves outside, or the complicated, dangerous man standing beside her. In the tense quiet that followed the wolves' retreat, a new kind of battle began. Elias worked, his hands sure and steady as he nailed a heavy plank over the shattered window, but his eyes kept returning to Ellie. The respect he'd shown her had been real, but the wall of his grief remained, and on her side, the ice of her suspicion had been cracked, but not melted. He was a thorn. That was a truth that could not be unwritten. She knew she could not live under the roof of this man, her life in his hands, without knowing where he stood. The risk of silence was now greater than the risk of truth. With trembling hands, she retrieved the oilskin pouch, walked to the table where he was cleaning his rifle, and unrolled Liam's legacy upon it. She said nothing, simply placed her finger on the faded pencil script in the margin. "Caleb knows. God forgive him." Elias stopped his work, his massive hands going still. He read the words, then read them again. A deep, shuddering breath escaped him. All the weariness of the world seemed to settle on his shoulders, the weariness of a man who had seen the worst of humanity and now found it festering in his own bloodline. "He is your brother," Ellie said, her voice barely a whisper, yet it cut through the silence like a blade. "I have to know." Elias looked up from the map, and the flat, empty look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a cold, terrible fire. He looked at her, at the fierce, desperate courage on her face, at the swell of her belly where Liam's child waited, and a decision was made. "He is my blood," Elias said, his voice a low, hard rumble. "But he is no kin of mine. Not anymore." He rose to his full, towering height. "What was done to your husband and to you is a debt that will be paid. You and this child will be safe under my roof. This I swear." It was not a promise of comfort. It was a soldier's oath, absolute and forged in iron. He strode to a heavy wooden footlocker at the end of his bed, a chest she had never seen him open. He unlocked it, the contents shrouded in shadow, and drew out an object wrapped in oilcloth. It was a pistol, a Colt Peacemaker, its handle worn smooth with use. It was smaller, more elegant than the massive revolver he wore at his hip. He held it out to her, butt first. "It was my wife's," he said, his voice thick with an old, ragged pain. "Sarah. She was no fighter, but she believed in being prepared." He placed the cold, heavy steel in her hands. "Protection isn't a gift to be given. It's a tool to be wielded. Tomorrow, I'll teach you how to use it." The valley soon learned a new sound, one that cracked through the morning stillness, sharper than a woodsman's axe, the repeated report of Sarah's Colt. Elias was a patient teacher, his instructions stripped to their bare essentials. Don't fight the kick, absorb it. Breathe out as you squeeze, don't pull. He stood behind her, his presence a mountain at her back, his large hands occasionally adjusting her stance, his touch impersonal yet steadying. Ellie, the Boston teacher who had once believed the written word was the most powerful tool in the world, slowly learned the grim grammar of gunpowder and lead. The blisters on her hands were a testament to her progress, a painful flowering of a strength she never knew she possessed. But it was in the evenings, after the guns were cleaned and the shadows grew long, that the true shape of their alliance was formed. In the quiet glow of the firelight, Elias would take out a block of clean-smelling pine and a carving knife. His massive hands, which could tame a wild horse or steady a rifle in a blizzard, moved with an almost impossible gentleness, peeling away delicate curls of wood. He was carving a cradle, its headboard slowly taking the shape of a soaring hawk. He never spoke of it, but every night, the promise of a future for her child grew more solid under his patient blade. In these quiet hours, words finally came more easily. She told him of Boston, of the crowded streets, and the sea of books she'd left behind to follow a man with a dream etched on a map. He, in turn, shared small, polished memories of his past, like stones worn smooth by a river of grief. He spoke of his daughter Lily's fascination with wildflowers, and the way his wife Sarah could tell a horse's temperament with a single glance. They were not stories of loss, but quiet affirmations of a love that had once filled this empty, silent house. A fragile, unspoken affection began to grow between them, born not of passion, but of a profound, shared understanding. One evening, as she watched him sand the smooth curve of a rocker, she said softly, "This valley is beautiful, peaceful. I understand why you never left." Elias's hands stilled on the wood. He stared into the fire, the muscles in his jaw tight, the light catching the old pain in his eyes. "I didn't stay because it was peaceful, Ellie," he said, his voice low and ragged. "I stayed because I couldn't leave. After I buried them, this place stopped being a home. It became a prison, a penance." He finally looked at her, his soul stripped bare. "I failed them. I don't deserve another life. This ranch is the only one I've got left, and it's my own private hell." Of course. Here is the next chapter. Spring arrived not as a gentle guest, but as a conqueror. The sun waged a brutal war against the snow, and the valley filled with the roar of meltwater rushing in newborn creeks. The air, once sharp and sterile with cold, now carried the rich, damp scent of thawing earth. With the change in seasons came a change in the silent cabin. Elias's confession had not been a wall between them, but a doorway. A quiet understanding now flowed in the space his words had cleared, and a fragile hope began to take root in the soil of their shared loneliness. They worked side by side, mending fences and clearing fields, a man and a woman slowly rebuilding a life from the wreckage of two. But miles away, in the muddy streets of a makeshift mining town called Purgatory, the winter had failed to kill the snakes. Caleb Thorne nursed a cheap whiskey, his mood as foul as the cigar smoke that stained the saloon's air. His search for silver had yielded nothing but dust and debt. All winter, he'd been haunted by the ghost of Liam Vance's map, by the unshakable feeling that he had been cheated of a fortune. He was about to leave when a ragged, half-starved man stumbled through the doors, a face Caleb vaguely recognized from his original party. The man was telling a wild tale to anyone who would buy him a drink, a rambling story of a winter spent half mad in the mountains. "Saw it myself," the man slurred. "A ghost, I tell you. A pregnant woman, living up in the high country with that monster of a man, the one they say is touched by grief." Most of the saloon patrons laughed, dismissing it as whiskey-fueled fantasy. But Caleb went still, his glass halfway to his lips. He grabbed the man by the collar, his voice a low, dangerous hiss. "What monster? What homestead?" The man, terrified, stammered, "The Thorne place, up in the Wind River Valley. It's his brother, they say. The big one." Elias. Caleb released him, the man scrambling away as if he'd touched a hot iron. The pieces clicked into place with chilling certainty. Ellie, alive. And with his brother, on the one piece of land Caleb could never touch. A slow, predatory smile spread across Caleb's face, chasing the bitterness from his eyes. She wasn't a ghost to be mourned. She was a map to be claimed. And the hunt, he realized with a surge of adrenaline, was on again. Caleb Thorne moved like a man possessed. Hope, for a man like him, was a more potent fuel than whiskey, and the hope of Liam Vance's silver had transformed him from a bitter drunk into a methodical predator. He knew he could not face Elias alone. His brother, for all his quiet grief, was a man forged in the crucible of war, as much a part of the Wyoming wilderness as the granite cliffs. So Caleb went hunting for a different kind of animal in the dark corners of purgatory. He found them in the bottom of whiskey glasses and behind the cold eyes of men who had gambled away their last chance at a decent life. He didn't offer them a partnership, he offered them a cut. Two men, a gaunt, twitchy-eyed drifter named Skinner and a hulking brute who went only by Jed, listened as Caleb spun his tale. He painted Ellie as a cunning seductress who had stolen his claim and was now holding his grief-stricken brother hostage. "We're not going there to hurt anyone," Caleb said, his voice smooth and reasonable. "We're going to retrieve my property and rescue my brother from a bad situation. For your trouble, you'll be rewarded handsomely when the silver starts flowing." Skinner and Jed didn't care about the truth. They cared about the glint of silver in Caleb's eyes, and that was enough. They rode out at dawn, a small, grim party cutting a path back toward the Wind River Range. They stopped at the abandoned camp, the crude lean-to, now just a skeleton of rotting canvas and broken poles, and they stopped at the simple wooden cross that marked Liam's grave. An obsessive, paranoid thought had taken root in Caleb's mind. What if Liam had buried a copy of the map with his body? "Start digging," he commanded, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. Under the cold spring sky, they committed the ultimate desecration. They unearthed the shallow grave, the shovels biting into the rocky soil with a sickening scrape. There was no map. There was nothing but the quiet, shrouded remains of a good man. A wave of pure, unadulterated rage washed over Caleb. The last vestige of his humanity seemed to wither and die in that open grave. This was no longer just about silver. It was about possession, about eradicating the ghost of Liam Vance and the woman who dared to survive him. He kicked the simple wooden cross aside, shattering it. "He didn't have it," he snarled at his men, his face a mask of fury. "Which means she does." He stared north toward the mountains that hid his brother's ranch. "Let's go pay my family a visit." The finished cradle sat in the corner of the cabin, its pine wood glowing in the warm afternoon sun, a silent testament to a future they were daring to build. For the first time in years, a genuine peace had settled over Elias Thorne's isolated ranch. It was shattered by the nervous whinny of a horse. Elias, who had been mending a harness on the porch, went still. He scanned the tree line, his eyes missing nothing, the quiet rancher gone, the weary soldier taking his place. 3 riders were emerging from the pines, moving with the slow, predatory confidence of wolves closing in on a kill. He recognized the man in the lead instantly. "Ellie," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Get inside. Bar the door and stay low." Caleb did not charge the cabin. He was a serpent, not a bull. He and his men circled just out of rifle range, their presence a suffocating weight on the small homestead. Then the psychological assault began. "Brother," Caleb's voice, a slick poison on the wind, echoed across the clearing. "Are you in there? I've come to save you from that lying witch. Did she tell you how she watched her own husband die?" He laughed, a cruel, ugly sound. "Or are you still hiding, Elias? Hiding like you did when your own little girl was freezing in the snow?" Inside, Elias's face was a mask of stone, but Ellie saw the tremor in his hands, the agony of old wounds being ripped open. Suddenly, the sharp crack of a rifle shot echoed from the woods to the east. It wasn't from Caleb's party. It was Old Man Hemlock. The trapper must have seen the riders and was trying to create a diversion, a desperate attempt to help his friend. The ruse lasted only a moment. Caleb wheeled his horse, pointing a finger toward the trees. "Skinner." "Shut that old fool up." Another shot rang out, followed by a thin, pained cry that was swallowed by the vast indifference of the wilderness. Elias let out a choked, guttural sound of rage, his knuckles white on his rifle stock. He took a step toward the door, his control finally breaking, a blind fury in his eyes. But a sharp gasp from behind him stopped him cold. He spun around. Ellie was leaning against the table, her face ashen, her hands pressed hard against her swollen belly. A wave of pain had contorted her features, her breath coming in ragged pants. "Elias," she breathed, her eyes wide with a mixture of terror and disbelief. "The baby. It's coming." The word hung in the air, a death sentence and a prayer all at once. Outside, his brother waited to kill them. Inside, their child was fighting its way into the world. The siege had begun on two fronts, of course. Here is the final, climactic chapter of the confrontation. All the soldiers' training, all the years of disciplined grief could not have prepared Elias for this. His world narrowed to the confines of the cabin, a space besieged by both birth and death. Outside, Caleb's taunts gave way to the impatient crack of rifle fire. Inside, Ellie's world had shrunk to the rhythm of cresting, unbearable pain. Elias moved between the two fronts, a giant caught in a war for the future, and a haunting echo of his past. He shoved the heavy table against the door, fired a warning shot through a slit in the wall, and then knelt by Ellie's side with a basin of water, his huge hands surprisingly steady as he wiped the sweat from her brow. The assault, when it came, was brutal and direct. Jed, the hulking brute, used a felled log as a battering ram against the door, the impacts shuddering through the entire cabin. Elias returned fire, his shots measured and deadly, but he was one man against three, and his attention was fatally divided. Another contraction seized Ellie, her cry drowned out by the splintering of the door frame. As Elias was pinned down, reloading, she saw a flicker of movement. Skinner, trying to climb in through the window he'd broken earlier. "Elias! The window!" she gasped. In that moment, as Elias turned to deal with the new threat, the main door finally gave way. Caleb burst in, a triumphant, demonic grin on his face. But the scene that greeted him was not the one he expected. Elias was not cowering. He was a force of nature unleashed, a cornered bear defending his den. The fight was short, savage, and absolute. When it was over, Jed lay still on the porch, and Skinner had fled into the woods. Caleb stood alone, disarmed, his face a mask of disbelief. Elias's massive hands locked around his throat. "You took everything from me," Caleb choked out, his eyes wild with hatred. "This land, the silver, always you." "This was never about silver," Elias growled, his voice a low tremor of controlled rage. Caleb laughed, a ragged, ugly sound. "No? Then what's it about, brother? Playing house? You think this makes up for them? You couldn't save Sarah. You couldn't save Lily. You let them die alone in the snow." The words struck Elias like a physical blow, the old guilt threatening to drown him. He faltered, his grip loosening for a fatal second. It was then that a new sound filled the cabin, silencing the rage and the hate. It was the first strong, indignant cry of a newborn child. Caleb stared, momentarily stunned. From the bed, her face pale, but her eyes burning with a fire that outshone the sun, Ellie raised the Colt pistol Elias had given her. The barrel was rock-steady in her hands. "He couldn't save them," she said, her voice exhausted but clear as a bell, ringing with the fury of a mother protecting her young. "But he just saved this family." The following spring, the valley was filled with a new sound, the delighted laughter of a child. The Thorn Ranch was no longer a fortress of grief, but a home, its silence filled with the small, happy noises of a family. Caleb, handed over to the law along with his surviving accomplice, was a distant nightmare, his dark chapter in their lives closed by the gavel of a federal judge. The Liam Vance silver lode, now rightfully belonging to Ellie and her son, was being worked by honest men under the watchful eye of a fully recovered and surprisingly shrewd old man Hemlock, its riches building a future for the valley, not just one man's greed. William Liam Thorne, a boy with his mother's determined eyes and a strength that was all Elias, took his first wobbly steps near the hand-carved cradle. Elias, no longer a ghost in his own home, would lift his son onto his broad shoulders, his laughter a deep, warm rumble that seemed to shake the last of the shadows from the cabin's corners. He was a father again, not as a replacement for a loss, but as a man who had been given a second chance at a life he thought was over. Ellie, watching them from the porch, felt a peace so profound it was almost a physical presence. One bright afternoon, when the scent of pine and new grass filled the air, the three of them walked to the small, quiet hill that overlooked the ranch. 3 simple wooden crosses stood there now. 2 were weathered by time for Sarah and Lily. The third was newer for Liam. For a long time, Elias had not been able to look at the first 2 graves without being consumed by a guilt that was a prison of its own. Now he stood before them, William holding his hand, and looked at them with a gentle, quiet reverence. Ellie knelt, opening a small sack she had carried. Together they planted wildflower seeds around the base of all 3 crosses, their hands mingling in the rich, dark earth. They were not burying the past, but tending to it, allowing its roots to nourish the present. Elias looked from the weathered crosses of his first family to the woman and child who were his second, and the weary, haunted look of the old soldier was finally, truly gone. "They would have loved you both," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Ellie reached for his free hand, her fingers lacing with his. "They do," she said softly. "They're a part of us now." She looked at the 3 graves, their separate stories now joined by a blanket of future blooms. "Every family has different roots," she said, her eyes meeting his, full of a love that had been tested by fire and ice. "But we can choose to let them all bloom together, under the same sky." And so, in a valley where wildflowers now grow over old wounds, a new family was born from the ashes of betrayal and loss. Their story is finished, but it leaves us with one question. Do you believe it was destiny that brought Ellie and Elias together? Or was it simply a choice to survive and love again? Let us know in the comments below. Type 1 for destiny, or 0 for choice. If stories of the enduring human spirit and love forged in the heart of the unforgiving West are what you seek, make sure to subscribe and ring the bell. There are many more journeys waiting for us, just over the next ridge.